So Byron Reese has written a fascinating book with a fascinating title, Infinite Progress, How the Internet and Technology Will End Ignorance, Disease, Poverty, Hunger, and War. And probably a few more bad things, I think.
So let's. Well covered. That's a pretty good start.
That's a pretty good one. We want to start with how I want to go down this list and find out how the internet will end all of these things one by one. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Byron. He's the executive vice president of Demand Media, an avid deer hunter, and the American most traveled in history to North Korea.
What?
Yeah. So, also, Byron, are you involved in the NPR Happy News?
I started that site, as a matter of fact, yes. A long time ago.
That's awesome. Happy News on NPR. So let's.
Well, no. I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. I started a site called HappyNews.com, which was acquired by Demand Media, among other things. But not an NPR affiliated site, though.
All right. Well, we would love to hear some happy news. And is there a lot of happy news in your book?
Well, I think so. I think that I think if you can envision a world without hunger and disease and poverty and war, I think that's a pretty happy thing.
So, in a summary, how can you explain the concept behind your book? Why did you write the book, and what is the core message?
Well, I wrote it because it's a really interesting thing that if you look at any period of time, whether it's the last 100 years or the last 1,000 years or the last 10,000 years, anywhere in the world, by almost any measure, things have been getting better. I mean, you can talk about longevity, infant mortality, self-determination, access to education, standard of living. I mean, by any measure, things are getting better. And yet, somehow or another, we're at this place where a lot of people looking to the future assume it's going to be worse. And I think this is a really kind of insidious, bad viewpoint. Because pessimism is a very paralyzing, kind of fearful place to be. You know, if you're a pessimist, there's not really any reason to try to make the world a better place because you're going to fail. And so I wrote the book to make a positive case for an optimistic outlook. So it isn't a book that is like, oh, I hope things are going to be better. It's a book that actually tries to lay out a rational argument for why I think the future will be dramatically better than anything we've even attempted to imagine. And so the basis of it is that there are all of these problems that we have that have always been with humanity since the beginning. And what's interesting about them is many of them are at their core technological problems. Like if you think about it, disease is simply a technological problem. There's no reason you have to have disease. We just haven't figured out how to vanquish it. Hunger and poverty, these are technological problems. And if they are technological problems, then it stands to reason they have technological solutions. And, you know, we live in this era of Moore's Law where the capabilities of technology are doubling very predictably. And so you can think of it like it took us 4,000 years to get from the abacus to the iPad. And in 30 years from now, we'll have something as far ahead of the iPad as it is ahead of the abacus. And I mean, that's the kind of world that we're standing kind of at the edge of, just waiting to enter. And so that's why I think the world is, that these traditional problems of humanity are going to be vanquished, and that's how I think they're going to be as well.
Awesome. So it sounds like for medical, just the fact that you can, other surgeons can watch surgeons doing procedures and communicate about techniques and things can, instantly be spread across vast numbers of people and save lives right there.
Absolutely. There's 1,000 things like that. And I guess the kind of a way to think about it is, what's useful to me is to think about smallpox. So the last 100 years that smallpox existed, it killed 500 million people. So in 100 years, it killed probably more people than have died in every war in the history of all humanity. And yet we learned to vaccinate against that disease in the 1700s. The 1700s, before we even understood germ theory. Then you look at something like polio, which has been reduced in frequency around the world to it's now as common as getting struck by lightning. It's how uncommon it is. And we were able to vaccinate against that in a very low-tech era. And so you look at what we have today, which, we can deconstruct the genome of a virus. We can understand, we can gaze into its innermost core and deconstruct it, and we have all of these tools at our disposal, and there are all these economic incentives aligned to ending disease. And so I think very rapidly, one after the other, we're going to be able to just knock these out. I mean, disease, it won't be long before people will have an intellectual understanding that it used to be that people's bodies broke and we couldn't fix them, but it will be a very alien thing. It'll be a very, very odd thing for them to consider.
Fantastic. I was reading and watching a lot of your videos today, and I was wondering, I want to ask you a question. What is your definition of greatness? You talk about it not having to do with money, not having to do with power necessarily, and anybody can be great. What's your definition of greatness?
So in that talk, I was talking about having a dramatic positive effect on the world. So you leave the world fundamentally a better place than you found it. You're a net kind of giver to humanity, and to me, that's living a great life. And I think it is something that, when we're young, we often aspire to this. We have what we later look back and think were kind of unrealistic hopes and ambitions, and yet the truth of the matter is, the world does change, and I maintain it actually gets better. It has been getting better over the last few thousand years, and that is generally brought about by very ordinary people. And I use the word ordinary in the sense of average birth, of average ability, of all of this. Just regular people are these amazing forces for good in life. And so I'm very intrigued by this. In fact, I'm writing a book about kind of how to change the world, and I'm really trying to understand how certain people have these extraordinary outcomes for good. I mean, they just do these dramatic things, and what I was finding when I would do all of these interviews is there wasn't really people who had privileged birth or had a lot of money or had anything like great connections or something like that. It was generally people who just decided they were going to do it, and then they woke up and gradually, piece by piece, they started working towards some goal larger than themselves. And
what is the power of one human being, and how do they harness that and make something happen? Can you give us like a granular level example of that?
Well, I think if you wanted to kind of sequence people in terms of their impact on the planet, like recently, you would have to point at a guy named Norman Borlaug. So Norman Borlaug is this guy who's credited with saving 1 billion lives, and so he did this by going to nations that were often hungry and traditional food importers, such as Mexico and India and Pakistan, and he would work in these nations breeding wheat that was resilient in that area, and he helped turn these nations into food exporters. And as such, he dramatically decreased hunger in these parts of the world. And so, generally, people who have these kinds of impact, I don't know that he woke up some morning and said, "I'm going to save 1 billion lives." But what you do is, in whatever situation you're in, you look for a way to make an impact. Oftentimes, people who have these outcomes, they hold very carefully to certain ideals, but they're very fluid in their tactics. Like when new opportunities come along, they're very quick to say, "Oh, I'll do that," or "I'll change the strategy here," or "Oh, I had this opportunity." And so they always generally always have a big vision, but have a lot of flexibility about how they reach it. I talk about a guy named Don Schoendorfer, and Don was this guy. He went to, he visited the developing world, and he saw this old woman who couldn't walk, dragging herself across the street, and she had nobody to help her, and she had no wheelchair. And Don was this engineer, and he went back, and sometime later, he built a wheelchair out of plastic lawn chairs and bicycle tires and lawnmower tires. And the interesting thing about it is his original plan had been to kind of design and build it, test it, and then get other people to kind of take his plans and run with it. But the way things happened, people came to him and said, we want you to produce these. And so he ended up doing something he didn't plan to do, which was actually make these wheelchairs. And to date, he and his organization have given away over 700,000 of these wheelchairs. And so that's a person who's dramatically made the world a better place, but it wasn't kind of exactly how he had pictured it when he was in his day-to-day life. And yet he still had this overriding objective or vision that he was trying to accomplish.
Well, Byron, you've been called kooky and awesome and an idea generator with a gazillion ideas by your peers. How do you pitch an awesome idea?
Wow, let's see. How do I pitch an awesome idea? I think ideas kind of in isolation are pretty boring and are really hard to get excited about. Just this idea, this very still, abstract thing. And what we tend to respond to are stories that are about, they're very close to us and about our lives or our where we live or our world or something. And so I think oftentimes good ideas are framed as stories, not so much as abstractions. And so if one can tell a really compelling narrative that illustrates or demonstrates an idea, I think sometimes that can be an effective way to get people, to make it real to people that otherwise they wouldn't necessarily react that way.
Awesome. Okay. Do you have anything? I've got 100 here.
All right.
Actually, I have a thought.
Yeah.
Byron, you were talking about pessimism and the naysayers that go on and how these horrible things are going to happen in their future and what we're going to be dealing with. And then you talk about the narrative and the good narrative. I'm wondering if there's an element of human nature that enjoys the peril. That part of a good narrative to them is, what's the challenge? What horrific thing? So half the world is flooded, whatever that might be, that people find that entertaining. It's kind of on the same level of gossip.
Mm-hmm.
That
you're safe in the knowledge that everything's really horrible. You can't get worse than that, right?
I do think
maybe they're not optimistic, but they find it entertaining. They like it.
I do think there's certainly an element of that. And so the question is, is that a norm? Is that just kind of how things are? Or is that an aberration? And if you think back to, say, the 1950s or the 1960s, we have a cliched view of that time, but a lot of the cliches are actually quite true. And one of them was, it was a time that was obsessed with the future. And not actually just that, but anyway, it was a time that was obsessed with the future, and not just any future, but some awesome future. And this was a time when you had things like the car of tomorrow, the house of tomorrow, the job of tomorrow, and everybody kind of thought about the future, and it was going to be awesome, right? Like, your light bulb would never burn out kind of awesome. And what happened is, because people believed that, they got up and they said, well, somebody needs to put a man on the moon. Somebody needs to sequence DNA. Might as well be me. And people, got up and believing in these, they did them. They went about and made them happen. And so if it is in fact something that we like in this kind of dark way, I hope that it's not pervasive. I hope that's not kind of a new societal norm, because I think it's a pretty immobilizing kind of viewpoint, because people who think, the world's going, who was it that said, somebody said you don't polish brass on a sinking ship. And if you just kind of, everybody throws up their hands and says, oh, well, we're screwed. It's almost it is a self-fulfilling prophecy at that time. You see, I don't believe the future is going to be great, and I don't think the future is going to be terrible. I think the future is going to be what we make it to be. And if we're willing to embrace this vision of a world, Gene Roddenberry, the guy who created Star Trek, says in the future there'll be no hunger and there'll be no greed, and all the children will know how to read. And if we embrace that and say, we're going to make that, it's not just like a story, we're going to make that happen, I think we actually have a really, really good chance of bringing that world about. There's no systemic reason we can't. We have technology on our side, and so it's a powerful thought to think that 10,000 years of human civilization brought us to some computational capability, and in 18 months that's going to double. And then in 18 months, that's going to double. And then in 18 months, that's going to double. And it's just, we can't even kind of conceive of that, of the power behind that, the power to really radically transform people's lives. And so I guess that's why I wrote the book, to try to make this case and make this argument that we can have this world that I think we would all love to live in if we just work towards it.
Mm-hmm. So that is going to take collaboration. I can't wait to really dig into your book in the future. I wanted to ask you a little bit, too, about your first business. This might be digressing a little bit. I also want to get to the North Korea story, too. But you orchestrate, your first business is orchestrating elaborate practical jokes.
Oh, wow, that was a business?
Wow, yes, but you're going back to my, I was in college at the time. Since then I've sworn off such things, but at the time, yes, it's exactly what I did.
Can you give us an example of one?
I guess they're terrible. I guess convincing somebody that they had grown by lowering all their shelves and hemming up their clothes, something like that. Those sorts of things. Kids, I'm not sure what the statute of limitations on much of this is, so I'm hesitant to talk about them.
Okay.
But yes.
Well, that sounds like a nice segue to North Korea to me.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about North Korea.
So yesterday, I got a webcam into your home to do a pre-interview, little test, and you had some great artwork from the North Koreans. So tell us why are you the most traveled American to North Korea?
Actually, I might be the second most. I think maybe Bill Richardson of Arizona has been there more. But I love travel. I love going to places that are different than where I came from. And the DPRK, North Korea, is obviously very different. I went there the first time, and by the way, there are no prohibitions against Americans visiting that country. They really want American tourists, and if you go to the State Department's website and you turn to North Korea, it'll say perfectly fine to go. But I went there because they have something known as the mass games, and the mass games are the greatest spectacle, I don't know in the history of humanity, but certainly in the last several centuries. And so it's not a competition, as games might imply. It's more of 100,000 people all performing at once. So you have to picture yourself in the biggest stadium in the world, but you only sit on one side of it, because on the other side of it, they have these 50,000 people. So imagine it's 500 people across and 100 people up and down, and they hold up these cards that make these pictures, and the pictures are, they say, the largest pictures in the world because they're, the size of a stadium. And so you've got 50,000 people, and they're changing these cards out, and so the picture's always changing. And then you have this retelling of the story of the history of Korea in dance and song with tens of thousands of people all performing, and it really is an amazing thing. And so,
yeah, spectacle.
Yeah. Wow. What are the most interesting things about North Korea that maybe Americans don't know?
that they can go.
Yeah.
They're probably the best monument builders in the world. Like, they make these extraordinary monuments that they're eager to take you to see because they're really spectacular, and it really is a really beautiful country, and like I said, just a very different place. There are no all the traditional things you kind of take for granted, like billboards or convenience stores or something like that. It's just a whole different configuration of society.
So forgive me if this is a rather ignorant question, but it's my perception that North Korea doesn't have the most open access to technology and the internet as we do in communication. So that seems like a dichotomy for you to have the book, and what would your and to be traveling there so frequently, but what are the concerns about that for the country of North Korea?
Well, actually, I'm fascinated by places where technology isn't actually as pervasive as we're used to it. Because when you go to places, it's very interesting, when you go to places that are different than where you came from, what you kind of look at and notice are all the things that are the same. You're like, oh, that's just how we do it. And so if you're somebody who's prone to thinking about the future, as I am, when you go to places that are kind of squarely, in a different place or time or mindset, and you kind of see these commonalities, those are things that are kind of universals, that no matter what the circumstances, we as humans hold on to those. And the nature of technology and human progress is you can pretty well safely assume everything else is going to change. Everything else is going to change, except these things that are kind of these universal constants. And so I find such places to be very edifying.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, I did not know that we could travel freely to North Korea. I assumed it was off limits completely.
Yeah, it was
I just saw Dennis Rodman went there. I thought he had like special privileges.
Yeah, Dennis Rodman, he just does what we want.
Yeah.
He's like, no, we're doing this.
That's right. So, Byron, my closing question, and you guys feel free to jump in too. I think it's really fascinating, this point of view that you have, and I love it that you're being able to get out this positive look at the technology and internet. I definitely share that and think that it's all good. I remember when people used to complain about the credit card transactions. Oh, it's, and it turns out, right, it's more likely that someone's going to steal your credit card number out of your garbage can than be stolen off of the internet. And there's a lot of fear in a lot of the things that are new in technology for one reason or another. I just heard about the Google Glasses that you brought to the show in the first week, that people can be on the bus and film you having a private conversation with other people, and it's immediately registered in the Google Cloud. So can Google then do face recognition, and how kind of scary is that going to be?
A little creepy.
Yeah.
A little bit.
So it's very interesting to see. Do you have any point of view on that, Byron? Privacy issues?
Yeah, I would. Well, those are always a challenge. I will say a couple of things. One of them is, I think it's interesting you mentioned credit cards, because credit cards, the fact we can use them, and the fact they're so commonly accepted, only works because most people are are honest. Because, if you see a charge on your card and you call up and say, yeah, I never bought that, they remove the charge from your card, right? But you can imagine if everybody just said that about every transaction or even some large amount, the whole system would become untenable. And so many of these institutions and structures that we have rely on the basic goodness of people. And I find that actually quite encouraging. It's easy to kind of get caught up in the identity theft or credit cards being stolen, but they're relatively small things compared to the billions and billions of transactions that are all operate smoothly. And then the other thing I would say is I'm really intrigued by things that we've created the internet to do that have no offline corollaries. eBay being successful wasn't really a big surprise because the offline world had already invented garage sales, or PayPal wasn't a big surprise because the offline world invented Western Union. But you get these things like Twitter, and you think, okay, there's no offline corollary of that. And when you look at those things, they tell us a lot about ourselves. And one fascinating thing about the internet, total surprise, at least to me, is the extent to which we as individuals are willing to help other people for no hope of anything in return. Like if you post some problem you have, or a question like, oh, I'm going to Seattle this weekend with my kids, what are some things we should do? People will answer that, even though they have no upside for doing so. And so you think about the Creative Commons movement, you think about open source, you think about Wikipedia, and all of these things. We're basically altruistic at heart and honest, and we actually want to help each other. And technology has kind of revealed that and magnified it. And so I take a lot of comfort in that. And the last thing I'll say on that is, another thing is that when you invent blogs, boom, 100 million people start blogging. When you invent YouTube, millions and millions of people upload. When you let people comment on products, millions of people do it. And what it tells you is that we also had a latent desire to kind of want to express ourselves and weigh in on things. And technology enables that. And so I see all around me technology doing all these awesome, I know all the nefarious uses of the internet, but I think on balance we're creating it to do great things, and I think it reflects very well on us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so true.
Well, this has been fantastic. I want to ask you just one more thing. What would your advice be to someone, perhaps someone young, perhaps not, who is setting goals, and how would you advise them to set a goal to change the world or to do something great?
Well, I would say, there are two kinds of goals you can set, and they're both equally valid. And you should kind of just be intentional about what you're doing. And so one of them are goals that have a relatively minor impact, but have a high likelihood of success. And that would be like, you go to the park and you're like, oh, this playground equipment needs painting. And so you buy some paint and get permission from the city, and you go and paint it and make it beautiful. And, that's a good thing. You have done your bit to brighten your corner of the world, and more power to you. And you have an enormously high likelihood of success. And then there are these other goals on the other end that have a relatively low chance of success. Like if you're a doctor and you say, I'm going to cure cancer, I don't know that's likely, but the world needs 10,000 doctors to say, I'm going to cure cancer, and because somebody will eventually do it. And so I think kind of one of the first things to make is to kind of look at yourself and judge your own appetite for risk and the kind of impact you want to make and how well you can handle the discouragement of doing something, but shooting, and so kind of decide on that continuum where you want to be. And then the second thing I would say after that is, oftentimes people get caught up in the form of the thing and not the essence. And by that I mean most people a lot of times will try to decide. People get rigidly locked into a certain method or way of doing things. And I notice a lot of successful people are more dedicated to a principle. Like, I want to see more accessibility in my town for or something like that, and they are very broad and open-minded about how they're going to see that happen, as opposed to, I'm going to do this on the corner of this and this on this day and this time. So I would say that to kind of decide where you want to be on that risk certainty spectrum, and then figure out what broad objective you're trying to achieve, not what specific tactic you're embracing, and then look around you for opportunities to do that. Also, I will say that the last thing I'll say is most people who have enormous impacts on the world are single-minded and focused. You know, you think about Martin Luther King. You know, he wasn't about civil rights and indoor smoking, you know. Most of the time people find an issue or a cause that they're very passionate about, and they work tirelessly on that one thing. And that's how they make a lot of progress. So, you know, having a lot of focus going into it, I think, would be helpful as well.
Great. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Byron. And where can we get the book Infinite Progress?
Well, it's available on Amazon, of course. And you can go to ByronReese.com, BYRONREESE, ByronReese.com, and order it there.
All right, great. And we also want to extend to you a visit out to Napa Valley. If you're ever in the neighborhood, please stop by. I
would love to.
Yeah. Awesome. Johnny, Fandina, thank you very much for joining the show. Thank you to Jessica Ravello from ArcadiumSoftwareGames.com, Arcadium.com, and our wonderful wine of the month, To Me, Pinot Noir, and this is the Sonoma Coast. They give us 4 different wines for the month, so we're going to have a different wine every day. So thank you, everybody, for joining 5 o'clock somewhere. We'll see you tomorrow night with Wine Wednesday. And this is Mira Winery. Gustavo Gonzalez is their winemaker. He used to be the winemaker at Mondavi. And he is doing an experiment burying wine for aging at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
Heard about that.
Heard about this.
Yeah.
So there's some crazy stuff going on all over the place. I think this is going to be here tomorrow night to tell us all about that. So thank you again, Byron and Jessica, and we're out. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.